This is a special presentation of Milwaukee Public Television. Next Avenue, a community conversation. Caring for the caregiver. Now here's your host, Mark Segrist.
Welcome to the Medical College of Wisconsin here on Milwaukee's West Side. It's an honor to be here in this great institution of healing and learning in Milwaukee. This is part of the kickoff to a series of community conversations, part of our commitment to lifelong learning through Milwaukee Public Television and public broadcasting in general. A special welcome to members of our audience here in the auditorium on campus. It's great that you're coming out and participating in this, what we think is a very meaningful presentation and forum. And of course, we appreciate you following us on live streaming on the Milwaukee Public Television and Next Avenue website. As I said, this is a kickoff to a series of what we regard as an important series of community conversations pertaining to lifestyle issues of special interest to a special segment of our viewership. And to learn more about that, I'd like to invite up to the lectern for a moment my good friend and General Manager Ellis Bromberg. Ellis? Good to be with you.
Thank you, Mark. And hello, everyone. And we want to thank the Medical College of Wisconsin for hosting us today. Thank the Helen Bader Foundation for their support of today's event and the others that Mark referenced. We hope to do throughout the year community conversations about these subjects that are tied in with the Next Avenue initiative, national initiative, and the Next Avenue website. Now, I'm the general manager of the only public television station in southeastern Wisconsin, so the last week I have been spending a lot of time defending Big Bird and talking to folks about the importance of public funding for public media and public broadcasting. I want to make two quick points before I turn it back to Mark. Number one, this project is called Next Avenue. And it's a project that is geared to 50 and above with a number of different subjects that we're going to be addressing online and through the year in community conversations like this. The title Next Avenue was chosen because of our commitment to Sesame Street for decades. When we came up with this national initiative, the decision was made to call this Next Avenue, a bookend to Sesame Street, where we have served our youngest viewers for decades. Now we're serving our older and oldest viewers for decades. Second point is that this is a great example of what public television and public media is doing these days. Yes, we are in your home with Sesame Street and all sorts of programs for young and old, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. But we're also online with the Next Avenue website. We're also in the schools, K through 12, high schools, colleges, and lifelong learning in this case, all use our programs. And we're also in the community with conversations like this. That's what public television and public media is today. And we thank you for coming here today and supporting this effort. And we hope you enjoy the conversation. I know it's going to be a great conversation, and that you'll join us later in the year when we have additional community conversations. Again, thank you for coming today. Mark?
Thank you, Ellis. We appreciate that. All right, here we go. Now, our featured speaker for this evening is a national Next Avenue contributor. Her name is Sherri Snelling. Ms. Snelling is CEO and founder of the Caregiving Club and a nationally recognized expert as it pertains to helping the Caregiver Club, and national recognized expert on how to help caregivers balance self-care while caring for a loved one. In addition, we're joined by Dr. Rhonda Jean Voigt Montgomery, PhD. Dr. Montgomery is a Helen Bader Endowed Professor in Applied Gerontology at the School of Social Welfare and Department of Sociology, UW-Milwaukee campus, of course. She'll be sharing her research with us on aging and the effects of caregiving. Also sharing his expertise is Dr. Robert Gleeson, MD. Dr. Gleeson is director of the Executive Health Program at Froedtert in the Medical College of Wisconsin. He specializes in health risk assessment, recommending both preventive medicine and lifestyle changes to promote a healthier life. Following the formal part of our program, Ms. Snelling, Dr. Montgomery, and Dr. Gleeson will all be answering your questions and offering additional insight into living healthy lives while juggling some of life's most stressful demands. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our first presenter for the evening, Ms. Sherri Snelling, founder and CEO of the Caregiving Club. Ms. Snelling, the floor is yours.
Thank you. We're already up. Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and I want to thank our hosts, the Helen Bader Foundation, Milwaukee Public Television, and Next Avenue. As you know, caregiving is something that really we're all facing. Former First Lady Rosalind Carter said it best. She said there's 4 kinds of people in this world: those who have been caregivers, those who are caregiving, those who will be caregiving, and those who will need care. So right now, today, we know there are 65 million Americans who are providing care for a loved one. And here in Wisconsin, at any given time, there's between 500,000 and 725,000 of you out there who are caring for a loved one. So I just want to start by a show of hands. How many of you have either been a caregiver for a loved one or family member or are caregiving right now? There you go. We just proved Mrs. Carter's point. So obviously this is something that's really important. What I'm going to talk about today is a segment of the caregiving population that we call the sandwich generation. And I'm going to tell you who is the sandwich generation. We're going to talk about the special challenges facing this group, and then obviously we're also going to offer a few solutions. So, who is the sandwich generation? Well, we know that almost 4 out of 10 of all of those caregivers we just talked about are actually squeezed between caring for 2 different generations. They've still got children at home under the age of 18 that they're caring for, but now they're also turning to caring for an older parent. So they've got, you know, they're in the middle of caring for both generations, and they're also juggling with usually having a part-time or a full-time job. So about 72% are also working. So they have a lot of responsibilities that they're trying to juggle. And in fact, I call it the sandwich generation juggling act. So you've got all these balls in the air: children, career, job, caregiving. And what is the ball that is missing or getting dropped? It's the ball that we call self-care. So it's all about how do you care for yourself while you've got all these other people relying on you, all these other responsibilities, all these other needs. And that's where we're going to focus today. So obviously we know that one of the biggest issues that caregivers face, and what we've heard in so much of the research, is stress. Public enemy number 1 is stress when it comes to caregiving. We do know there's a great book out there called So Stressed, which really focused on all of the wonderful research that's been done around stress and women, and particularly women who are in a caregiving situation. And what these researchers found in aggregate is that over the last 100 years, women's biology has actually not kept up with all of what I call the noise pollution in our lives. We're constantly inundated with cell phone calls, texts, emails, kids playing video games, television on. There's just so much going on that in terms of being able to deal with this stress, to find that quiet, to kind of calm ourselves, has become really, really difficult. And actually, the researchers are calling this, it's really called subjective cognitive impairment, but of course everything has to have a term for it, so we call it the busy life syndrome. So if you're feeling stressed, know that you now have busy life syndrome. That's what you're facing. One of the studies that I came across that I thought you would find really interesting is the difference in men and women and how they deal with stress, particularly in a caregiving situation. Researchers at Bowling Green University actually found that, as we know, women are nurturers, so we're used to caring for people around us. But at the same time that we're giving all this care, we're worrying about our performance. Did I do it right? Was that the right decision? You know, did mom like this or that? Did I spend enough time? Am I giving enough to my boss, my kids, my spouse, my friends? We're constantly worried as women about how we're performing. Whereas men take, the sports analogy, the block and tackle approach. So men are very task-oriented. They've got their lists, and they say, okay, I've got to do this today, this today, this today. And they're really checking off the list in terms of how to deal with this, which actually is helping them cope a little bit better with that stress. So I think as females in the audience, we might want to take a little page out of the game plan, if you will, that men use in terms of caregiving. What we do know is that stress can lead to health issues and health risks. A study by the Commonwealth Fund found that Caregivers are actually twice as likely to develop chronic illness earlier in life because of the prolonged chronic stress that they face than the general public. So let me ask you a question right now. There's two things that are in this book, So Stressed. One is, can you lower your shoulders right now in the audience? Do you feel like you can drop your shoulders just a little bit? How about this? Is your tongue pressed against the roof of your mouth? Okay. I find myself, whether I'm sitting on a metro train or somewhere else, and my tongue is completely pressed against the roof of my mouth. This means you are stressed. The problem that we have with stress is that when we have other ailments, if you have a wound, you're going to put a bandage on the wound, you can see it. If you have a rash, you're going to go find an ointment because you can see the rash. You cannot see stress. It is invisible. And this is the problem when it comes to health risks, because it's all inside and what's happening with you, and we need to figure out ways to manage that. So what happens is chronic stress becomes what we call caregiver burnout. This is the entertainment portion of the presentation. And so often when I'm talking to caregivers, they talk about burnout and they say, it's just impossible, I can't deal with it. What am I going to do? I really think of stress as being the cause and burnout is the effect, particularly prolonged stress. So what is caregiver burnout? It is not just one incident or something in isolation, but it's when you have chronic fatigue. It is when you become frustrated and you just can't cope. You might be more angry than usual. You might yell or have outbursts. You might cry. You can't get to sleep. Insomnia is a huge problem for caregivers. You might be eating too much or too little. In other words, your health is on a slippery slope towards decline because you are just not able to cope and manage with all these things that are going on in your life. And so one of the things I talk about is, okay, so we talked about a juggling act. How do you become the master of your universe or the ringmaster of this circus that we call the sandwich generation caregivers? And I write about 7 tips that I'll take you through pretty quickly, but these are 7 ways that caregivers can actually start to manage their stress levels a little bit better and certainly learn how to balance self-care while caregiving. So let's start with the first one. If you don't do any of the rest of the things that I'm going to talk about, sleep is really one of the most important things when it comes to our health. We know, again, that caregivers don't get enough sleep. They have a lot of insomnia, a lot of awakenings during the night. Now, I've met people who have come up to me and said, I can really survive on 5 hours of sleep a night. It doesn't really affect me. I'm fine. Because obviously, a lot of the research says you should get at least 7 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. So that means you're not thinking about things even while you're laying in bed. You're not waking up at night thinking, oh my gosh, I forgot to do this. No, it's uninterrupted sleep is what we're looking for. Sorry. Boom. And so when you say I can get by on 5 hours of sleep, let me tell you about a little bit of research. First of all, there was a research done in Australia that showed if you get less than 6 hours of sleep a night, the next day your drowsiness will be equal to if you had a 0.05 blood alcohol level, which for a lot of states is almost near the illegal driving level. There was another research study that showed if you get less than 5.5 hours of sleep a night, even if you do everything else right, you're eating well, you're exercising, you will still gain 12 pounds over the course of a year. And this is because your metabolism is thrown off, and also your insulin levels are trying to adjust to this lack of sleep. So you can see where sleep becomes so instrumental in maintaining your health as a caregiver. The next thing is supplements and sustenance. And of course, you're noticing I came up with S words. So really this is about good nutrition and how to take care of our bodies. One of the things that caregivers, and just in general, I think that we do, we disconnect from our bodies. We don't listen. We're not paying attention. You have to think of your body as being your best friend. And if your best friend is trying to tell you something, you need to pay attention to that. So one of the things that I found is, how do you avoid what I call the 30 at 50? And what does that mean? Well, we know the average American gains between 1 and 2 pounds a year after our college years, in their 20s. So that doesn't sound too bad. 1 to 2 pounds a year, I can manage that, right? Well, when you are in your 50s, which is when you are having, your kids are growing up, but you're also entering your caregiving years, you now have a 30-pound weight gain. And this is going to affect your body mass index, your BMI, and your other health issues. So it really is a slippery slope. And in fact, the National Cancer Institute found that women who were at a normal weight in college and actually gained 30 pounds or had an increase in their BMI measurement of 5 points over the course of those years were twice as likely to develop breast cancer after menopause. So it definitely does have impact to your health to maintain a healthy weight and eat right. So how do you do that? There's a lot of obviously great information, and nutritionists and dietitians and others will talk to you about specifics, but I like the superfoods, which have been talked about by Dr. Oz and WebMD, but it's a list of foods that help you in terms of antioxidants, energy, and other things. So it's things like salmon, walnuts, oatmeal, which can actually help balance your insulin levels, particularly if you're pre-diabetic. And one of the great things, and other things like blueberries, obviously, and some great fruits, I think about eating the rainbow every day. So if you have a food that's red, orange, yellow, green, blue every day, you're pretty much hitting that good list of food that you should be eating. The other great news I have for you is that it includes chocolate, which I always find to be really helpful, particularly when you're dealing with stress. But if you have 1 to 2 ounces of dark chocolate every day, and that's 70% cocoa content, by the way, you'll actually decrease your cholesterol level by 10%. The other thing that is critical, particularly as we age, is taking a daily multivitamin. And there was a research study recently done that showed that the vitamin B complex, particularly for women, can enhance your mental acuity. So it will help you with focusing and staying engaged. So that's something that's been interesting lately. And then water. We hear all the time you should drink at least 8 glasses of 8 ounces of water. 64 ounces a day is what we've been told. The most recent studies, the Institute of Medicine is still saying 64 ounces, but other organizations are saying what you really should do, because our bodies are more than 70% water. So we have to stay hydrated. We have to continue to flush those toxins out of our body. Take your weight, divide it in half. That's the number of ounces of water that you really should be drinking every day. So if you're a 140-pound woman, you should be drinking 70 ounces of water. If you're a 200-pound man, you should be drinking 100 ounces of water. So I find that to be a little bit better measurement, because it's really more related to your body makeup and what you need in terms of hydration. The next thing is sunshine, or really vitamin D. There are 2 things that affect both us and also our older loved ones. One is something called seasonal affective disorder. And we know that depression can often hit when you become a caregiver. For women who actually are more prone to what we call SAD, and particularly those who live in regions where you don't see a lot of sunshine, so if you live in Anchorage or you live in Seattle, the seasonal affective disorder is actually a really serious mental health issue. And of course, vitamin D will help with that. The other thing that we know is that falls and the risk of falls is a huge problem, particularly for our older loved ones. Every year, 2 million seniors are taken to the emergency room because they've fallen, and we know that every 28 minutes, a senior actually dies from a fall in the home. And what can really improve prevent, I guess, your falls risk is vitamin D. They recommend that you increase your vitamin D intake by at least 800 IUs a day. You can get that through 10 minutes of sunshine. You can get that through omega-3 fatty acid foods like salmon, or again, walnuts, or calcium. Of course, if you're lactose intolerant, you'll have to find other methods. You can, and just the nutritious eating, and also the outside activity. One of the things that I found that was really interesting is I've done a lot of interviews with folks that you might call celebrities. Alan Osmond, who is the oldest of the Osmond brothers, I recently interviewed. He lives with multiple sclerosis. He actually takes 5,000 IUs of vitamin D a day, and he really contributes a lot of his management of his MS to his vitamin D intake and increase. Okay, sweating, which basically is our physical fitness part of the presentation here today. You know, we're told we should have at least 30 minutes of cardio exercise every day, and that sounds great. But one of the things that we maybe aren't hearing enough is it doesn't have to be 30 minutes straight. You can take it in increments. You can do 10 minutes 3 times a day. So that might be something like walking or hiking or bike riding, or simply taking the stairs if you're working. You know, something great. I was picked up at the airport yesterday by Allison, who works with the Helen Bader Foundation and MPTV, and I, of course, had my luggage, so my excuse was I was getting on the escalator, but Allison took the stairs, and I really applaud her because that's a simple way for caregivers to take a little bit care of themselves and get a little bit of exercise during the day. The other thing is stretching, it doesn't sound like exercise, but stretching will actually improve your flexibility and the lymphatic system, and then strength training. We know from the National Center for Health Statistics that we lose 1% of our bone and muscle mass every year. A caregiver told me a great story. She said, I can't get to the gym, I don't own weights, what do I do? Well, what she found is she was eating Progresso soup, and you know those cans are a little bit larger, and of course they're also Weight Watchers approved, which is great, some of the soups. And she said what she wound up doing is taking the 2 cans of soup and just carrying them around with her during the day. And while she was at home, she would just like do, bicep curls, and then she'd have to put them down for a minute, and she'd pick them back up. And I thought that was a great example of how caregivers get really innovative when they need to take care of themselves. Soothing is something else. You know, all of the things on the screen right now will boost your immunity. The Japanese research study recently showed that a 10-minute bath will actually help your vascular and lymph system, and it encourages bacteria-destroying properties. So you can boost your immunity that way. Aromatherapy, a lot of people think of this as New Age, but most of you probably know that aromatherapy has been around since the ancient Egyptians, and they use lavender to soothe. MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston is doing a lot of research around aromatherapy. They're finding that when you get an MRI, if you take a scented handkerchief into the actual test with you, that can help calm you and soothe you, particularly if it has lavender in it. They found that kitchen cleansers can help with nausea when you're going through chemotherapy. And they know that bubble baths actually improve your memory. So there's a lot of things going on with aromatherapy. And then the relaxation response is Dr. Herbert Benson. He wrote his book back in the 1970s. He founded the Body and Mind Institute at Massachusetts General Hospital. And it's a 10-minute breathing exercise that you can do every day. I will tell you a personal example. I'm a lifelong asthmatic and have had allergies since I was a kid. A year and a half ago, I read Dr. Benson's book, and I thought, I'm going to give it a try, because he said you can really help everything from arthritis on. I used to be on an inhaler, and I used to take medication for my allergies every day. Since I've been doing the relaxation response, I do not need medication anymore. My inhaler is gone, and my medications are gone. So personally, I can tell you, it definitely works. Simple touch, physical touch. This is really important. A lot of people don't think enough about this. I know sometimes it's hard. You don't want to intrude maybe on a caregiver's pain or what they're going through emotionally. Some people just aren't huggers, but I will tell you, it is so important to have physical touch when you're caregiving. You're watching the decline of a loved one, and that can be a very cold, chilling, frightening experience, particularly with a parent. We go back to our childhoods when we are watching somebody decline. And if you're not getting hugged and you're not getting somebody who's patting you on the back or holding your hand, it can really, it can hurt you even more than you know. They did a study in a neonatal institute and unit with babies, and they showed that the ones that were cuddled and hugged every day versus the ones that weren't, the babies that were cuddled actually thrived and had great immunity, and the ones that weren't declined. They cried all the time. They had low body weight. So it's really important. And I told a personal story a couple of days ago about a friend of mine whose husband was going through cancer treatment for 3 years. He went through painful chemotherapy. He was not able to wrap his arms around her anymore. And she said to me, I just need a hug. I need somebody to hug me. And I think we don't often think about that. So if we have a friend who's a caregiver, or we're a caregiver ourselves, ask for the hug or give the hug. It's really critical. And finally, setting limits. It's really important to understand how to learn to say no and also how to find help. So those are kind of my 7 tips. Now, the question I've always gotten is, Sherri, that sounds all great. How do I find the time to do all this? I mean, I don't have time right now to maybe take a shower or whatever. So how do I find the time to take care of myself? And I will tell you that there are 3 avenues that you can look for in terms of getting this help. First of all, as we said, 7 out of 10 sandwich generation caregivers are working. There's a lot of support that you can find through your employer. So whether it's through your employee assistance program, sometimes you can get access to a geriatric care manager. They really are your expert, your coach in caregiving, help you navigate everything that you can possibly imagine. There's a lot of companies offering flex time or telecommuting. Some companies I've talked to are starting on-site support groups, and we certainly know that the organizations like the Alzheimer's Association have wonderful support groups for caregivers. FMLA is the Family and Medical Leave Act, which is really critical. You should understand that you do get your 12 weeks of unpaid leave to care for a loved one, and I think here in Wisconsin it's one of the states where there might be some paid benefits. I know there are a handful of states and even some employers that will offer that. So employers are a way, and I just wanted you to notice in the word career that the first 4 letters are care. So always keep that in mind, that caring for yourself is as important as maybe the career that you have or the job that you have. Getting help from family and friends. You know, one of the things that caregivers say is that when they get into a caregiving situation, family and friends say, what can I do to help? And of course, as a caregiver, you don't have your list ready. You don't have, okay, I need this done on Wednesday and all of this. You know, you're in a crisis mode usually. But there are really wonderful solutions out there, a lot of online tools now. So whether it's lots of helping hands, Caring Bridge, the Alzheimer's Association, a lot of the different disease organizations have online communities where you can, as a caregiver or friend, go on and put into a calendar where you need help. I need my kids picked up from soccer. I need a meal delivered here. I'd love to have somebody go visit my mom in the nursing home. Then you invite your family and friends into your private community, and they get, so that everybody benefits. They get to help you. They really give you that respite, that break. You get the help that you need, and as I said, everybody wins. So it really is a really important outlet for caregivers to look for. And again, Mrs. Carter, when I talked to her, she said the 2 things that caregivers need to think about is they need to ask for help and accept help. And that's really tough as a caregiver. Sometimes we're like, no, I'll take care of it myself. You have to find the breaks. You have to accept that help that's being offered to you. And then I have something called Me Time Monday. There's a nonprofit organization called the Monday Campaigns, and they have Healthy Monday campaigns that they run. And I became partnered up with them a couple of years ago when I started Caregiving Club, because I was obviously very involved in this me time. How do you find that me time as a caregiver? And I love their concept because they use research from Johns Hopkins University saying that Monday is part of our cultural DNA. Monday is the start of the work week, start of the school week. It's kind of when we reset. And the great thing about Monday versus resolutions is you get 52 chances to do something for yourself. So I always encourage and have tips that I write about on how to find your Me Time Monday. And one of the things that I tell people is, you know, me time is really about you. It's not about what you have to do, like exercising or taking care of your kids or whatever. It's what do you like to do as an individual. And I ask people, what did you do when you were a kid? Go back to that, you know, find that inner child. What did you like to do? There's a really great, I want you to go to this website if you have a chance. Volkswagen actually did research grants across the world. It was international, and they put it out there and they said, we want people to adopt healthier behaviors. How do we do that? We want it to be fun. We know if it's fun, people will do it. And my favorite, who I think won one of the top grants, was something called piano stairs. And if you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube. So if you put in Volkswagen Fun Theory or piano stairs, it'll bring it up. It's a research group in Sweden. And what they did is they took the metro, the train, and there was an escalator and there were stairs. So back to my stair analogy. And they filmed the first day. And what they found is every single person coming on and off that train took the escalator, of course, right? So then that night, what they did is they went in, they painted the stair steps like piano keys, and they also wired each step to correspond to the piano keys. And the next day, people were coming on and off the metro, and they were like, what is that? And they'd go over and they'd step on the key and the music would come out. All of a sudden, they filmed this. You have people of all ages playing on the steps, going up and down the steps several times, obviously fun. and getting healthy behavior. So I thought that was just a great example of what can be done. And lastly, as we said, balancing self-care while caregiving. I give this analogy to caregivers all the time. You need to visualize a seesaw, or for those of you who, boomers, teeter-totters. But think about your life in terms of, on one end of the seesaw, you have your career, your job, your family, your kids, and you have caregiving. And on the other side of the seesaw, you have you. And what happens is, if either end of that seesaw goes up or down, you're going to fall off, you're going to get hurt, somebody's going to be in pain. You need to keep the balance on the seesaw. And it's the most important thing I think that caregivers can do. These are some great resources. I didn't mention, but really quickly, caregiver stress tests. If you feel like you are facing a lot of stress, the Alzheimer's Association on their website has a wonderful caregiver stress test. The American Medical Association also has one. And you can take that test, and then if you score off the charts, you really should talk to your physician, talk to your doctor about how do you manage your stress a little bit better. And then lastly, just really quickly, because I know I'm out of time, I did write a book that will be coming out in February. It's a combination of kind of what to expect when you're caregiving, lots of great tips and information and resources, and taking you through that journey and those care transitions. And I also interviewed, as I mentioned, quite a few people whose names that you'll recognize who talked to me about their personal caregiving journey, gave me great tips on what they didn't know when they became a caregiver and what they wanted to share with the rest of us on what to expect. So, thank you.
Sherri, thank you so much. That was great information, and one of the points that all of our presenters this evening is helping us better understand is that none of us is immune from this. At one time or another, we're all going to be facing decisions pertaining to a loved one, and making sure that they are being cared for properly and with great dignity. So that brings us to our second speaker this evening. Our second presenter this evening is Dr. Rhonda Jean Voigt Montgomery, PhD. She is from the Helen Bader School of Social Welfare at UW-Milwaukee. It's with great pleasure now that I welcome to the lectern Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. I need to thank the sponsors here, and I'm going to take you in a little different direction. My work has really been working with and studying caregivers for about 25 years. And one of the things that we learned through this process is while I came up across two questions through this work. And one question was, why is it that the people who are doing the very most, doing it the longest length of time, aren't always the people who are the most stressed? At the other hand, I could run into people who were doing very little, had done it for a very short time, and they were ready to give up tomorrow. So that was one of the questions that we began to think about. The second thing that I've learned through this is when I started working with caregivers, I used to talk about the caregiving career. But what I learned from caregivers is they don't want a career in caregiving. So what I'm going to share with you is the caregiver journey. All caregivers are on a journey, but they don't necessarily want a career. So I want to share with you what that journey looks like. And I also want to share with you how that journey brings around stress and depression at different times. Because one of the other things we figured out is there's a lot of differences among caregivers. Lots of things are very, very different. But what we also found is there's some really key patterns in what takes place, and I want to share those patterns with you. So I'm sharing my little caregiver here who is on a career or on a journey here. And what I want to show you is that we've identified 5 phases to the caregiving journey. And one of the things that you see in this is our little caregiver went along this journey, that caregiver changed colors. And that's what's critical. Because through the years, as I started doing focus groups with caregivers and started thinking about them, one of the things I would always ask is, what is the hardest thing you do? What's the hardest thing about being a caregiver? And not once, and I'll tell you, not once did a caregiver answer something about the actual physical care tasks. Almost always, the answer was about the emotional work that was going on as they were taking their journey. So I want to tell you about that emotional journey. Caregiving is a journey of changes, and we see 3 significant changes, and understanding those changes helps us understand when caregivers experience high levels of stress, and it also helps us understand how to take it out. What we have is, first, in that journey, we see they change the activities they're doing, which is the tasks and responsibilities they take on. They change the relationship with the person they're caring for, and you can't change that relationship without changing a whole sense of who you are, or what I call your identity. So let's take a look at each of those. So first I'm starting, I call this my rainbow slide. And what this is showing is sort of the typical rainbow of how different care tasks start in very small amounts and increase over that journey. So what you're looking at is the number of hours that a caregiver might spend in each of these different types of tasks in a given week. And what you're looking at is how this changes over a typical 5-year period that an adult child might be a caregiver. So what we see is usually caregiving starts, we really don't know we're caregivers, and I'm going to come back to this. One of the things I had trouble with throughout all the years was trying to do studies on caregivers, and when I would advertise for them, I couldn't find them. Because caregivers are husbands and wives and sons and daughters, and many of them don't know they're caregivers until they're in crisis. And they don't show up at our doorsteps until they're in crisis. So understanding how they get to those crises and how we help them out of those crises is important. So what usually happens, as you see the very bottom stripe, is the few hours that a caregiver might spend in dealing with things like banking and the legal things for mom. Or in the case of a wife, you might be taking on things that had always been the husband's job or duties. And then we see that they might start adding some hours that are spent in shopping and transportation. And then, depending on the disability and the condition of the care receiver, you see that they'll start taking on household tasks. They might do those, the cooking and other things that are going on. And then I add the other tasks. I call those seasonal. Since we're in Wisconsin, that's the snow shoveling and the raking. It can be different things in different areas, but I can't categorize them. But what's really critical is the last one. The deep purple there that's the hours of personal care. Now, what's important about this slide is look how that changes over that 5-year period. And what that means is the experience of that caregiver in the early part of this journey is very, very different than the experience of that caregiver in the later part. And it's not just about the tasks. Because the minute you change those tasks, you change the relationship. Because when people become dependent, there's no dependency without a power imbalance. Because when you depend on somebody else, that's giving somebody else power and control over parts of your life. And what we see happen over the time, to really illustrate this, is take a look at what this looks like. This is the typical parent-child relationship when we have young children and parents. And you see I put all those same kind of tasks up there, and I want to point out one other thing that the caregivers have pointed out to me. It's not just the care tasks that I shared with you in terms of the tasks of what they're doing, but there's also this shift in decision making, and that's very critical, especially when spouses are caring for one another. So what we see in the typical child-parent relationship, everything's on one side. The balance, that's what it is. And in fact, Well, if you do you get a little affection there, but I say even that is a little wobbly because babies cry and teenagers whine, and it isn't always a positive thing when you're in a caregiving situation. I've also learned when I used to start talking about this, I had young children. Then I had teenagers, and then I had 20-somethings, and now I have 30-somethings. And as the literature tells us, everything is down generation as long as parents are healthy. But what happens is when we shift the other way, this is what happens in a caregiving relationship. We see those tasks slowly but ultimately shift to the other side. And again, we even see the little wobbly affection because sometimes care recipients aren't always positive. And one of the things we talk about family caregiving is if it's all warm and fuzzy. It isn't always warm and fuzzy. There can be very difficult times and you can get very negative messages. So what we see is you have not only a change in what people are doing, but you have that ultimate change in the relationship and the dynamics of that relationship. And in order to understand what this does, is in every relationship you have, whether it's caregiving, think of yourselves in your job, think of yourselves as a parent, we carry around sort of a rule book. I always say I still have my mother's tape recorder in my head. And that rule book tells us how we're supposed to behave in that relationship. So the example I'm showing you here is if I have a healthy mother or a healthy father, I am operating out of a rule book that says this is what good daughters do. But what happens when we see that change in the relationship, I have a new rule book. This is what good caregivers do. But it isn't that simple. It's not like you take one and throw the other away, because you never stop being that daughter. You never stop being that wife. You never stop being that son. So you still have some rules, but we also have rules that can go in conflict. So where it has always been the rule in your marriage that you share decisions, you now have somebody who's incapable of making decisions. We find caregivers, that can be very stressful because you are doing things that feel against your rules. And this is what's very critical, and I want to share with you. So we're on this journey, and what we find is there's sort of 5 phases in this journey in which all of a sudden you come across this fence. You're going along, you're reading your rule book, you think you know what you're doing, but really what's happening in our example is you're thinking out of your daughter book. And in this case, we see it's sort of a 50-50. I'm kind of half daughter, I'm half caregiver, and I figured out those rules. But the truth is caregivers do what caregivers see has to be done, even when it's out of their comfort zone. So what they find themselves doing is many care tasks and taking on many responsibilities that are much more as a caregiver. And what we see is when people move between phases, they get stuck on this fence because they're thinking one way with a set of rules, but the situation is forcing them to act another way, and that causes strain. And we have a label for that. We call it identity discrepancy. And my best illustration is this. If this is my rules, and I put my rubber band around it, but this is my behavior, the further I stretch, the more tension I have. What I have found, it's not what a caregiver is doing, but it's what they're doing relative to what they expect to be doing given the rule book from which they're operating. And what happens is people get a little stuck on that fence because as the condition of the care recipient changes, they need to keep changing their rule book. What we have found is that identity discrepancy is like a barometer. We have found our little measure of discrepancy is the best predictor of stress, of depression. In our studies, it is amazing. We have found the level of depression is somewhere between, depending on our studies, it has ranged between 60 and 85% of our caregivers coming into our studies are at the level of clinical depression. In our military families, which I've been working with, our returning wounded warriors, that was 90% of the caregivers were over the threshold in our measures for clinical depression. So, the wonderful thing about thinking about it this way is it also tells us how to begin to solve it, because it's quite clear. If I want the tension out of this, I have a couple of choices. I can change my behavior, or I can change my rules. So let me show you what happens here. So we're back to our journey, and as I'm telling you, we have 5 phases. And I'm going to show you little pie charts that show how people are really thinking in each of those phases. In the first phase of caregiving, most caregivers don't know they're caregivers. You can't find them. They don't show up at your door because there's only a sliver of what they're doing that has that sense of, I'm a caregiver. They're really operating out of that daughter book. And I say that goes along until all of a sudden, and I say this is all of a sudden, you don't wake up one day and say, I want to be a caregiver, but you do wake up one day and say, wow, I am a caregiver. Because you realize that the responsibilities or tasks that you're taking on really are stretching outside of your rule book. And it can be different for different people. Because we see that children come to this realization much earlier, because you really acknowledge when you're cleaning mom's house, or in my case, when I'm driving to work trying to deal with all the financial issues of my mother over the telephone with my sister. And then my sister-in-law makes for a long caregiving ride on the way in, and you go, wait, I may even be long distance, but I'm a caregiver. And when you move into that, you have this next phase, which is really kind of a quarter. And the next phase, the next marker, is when caregivers begin doing some kind of hands-on care. It's okay to lay out the clothes, but it's sort of strange to have to help mom dress. In the case of a spouse, it's okay to sort of help them dress, but wow, do I have to do toileting? That really takes me out of my comfort zone. And it is a marker when a lot of people exit. When I say there's 5 phases, not everybody makes it through all of those phases. And we do see people saying, nope, this isn't for me. The 4th phase is when people kind of come to terms with it. And you often hear people say, she's not really my mother anymore, but I have an obligation. And they buy into the role of caregiver. And the 5th phase comes, and at this point, what you see is when they begin for the first time, the very first time, we know that this phase is starting, that they think about some other placement. A nursing home, assisted living, my sister's house, but I'm thinking, I want to get out of this. And then, of course, the last phase really looks much more like the 2nd phase, because if you do act on that decision, then you can, to some extent, regain your relationship. What's critical about all of this is that identity discrepancy plays out in what we've identified as 3 different types of stress. One is what we call objective burden, or similar to what we've just been hearing about, that sort of juggling. The other is just sort of that anxiety that comes, what we generally think about stress, and often that's about the worry and the anticipation of what's coming. And the last form, which is really critical, it is the strain in that relationship. So, I'm kind of telling you about this journey because what we know is every time somebody's about to move to the next phase, that's when we see high stress levels. So the very first thing we need to do as a caregiver is decide which way are we going to go. Are we going to bring our behaviors and our responsibilities much more in line with the role we were in, which is closer to that original familial role? Or are we going to come to terms with, this is the level of disability and the need, and I'm willing to embrace? What we need to do is work with caregivers and decide which is best for you given your condition, and then we can figure out, how do I go get help to make that leap? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Montgomery. Thank you for taking us on that walk. Our 3rd and final presenter this evening is Dr. Robert Gleeson from Froedtert Hospital and the Medical College of Wisconsin. Doctor, please join us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today. You know, along this caregiving journey, caregivers have a villain. The villain is that they lose the time to care for themselves. They've lost their own ability to pay attention to what's happening with them. And that's what they have to focus on. It's really quite simple. They're not different rules because you're a caregiver than they were when you were not a caregiver. It's the same kind of set of rules. But our problem in America is that most people, caregiver or not, don't follow the rules of good health. These rules really matter. The New York Times on Monday had an article that said that Japan was trying to control health care costs for the elderly by having them talk and walk. They were making the elderly in Japan exercise in the park. They had big programs to encourage this because they knew that exercise mattered. They had big programs to help people socialize because they knew that when the elderly socialized, they did better. Japan believes in this enough to believe that it will reduce their health care costs for the elderly. They have a crisis. Our crisis is handling ourselves when we're on this caregiving journey. We owe it to ourselves and to the person we're caring for to stay healthy. I have 3 rules to fight this villain. And the first is, take a 30-minute walk every day. Everybody knows that rule. How many people do it in America? Yeah, people are smiling in the audience. It's about 20 or 30% of Americans do the equivalent of a 30-minute walk every day. We could defeat diabetes if we could get everybody to walk 30 minutes, 7 days a week. Jack LaLanne, remember Jack LaLanne, the fruit juice guy? Who could do 1,000 push-ups kind of thing when he was 90? He said, we don't get old from doing too much. We get old and tired from doing too little. I'm not saying we need to do what Jack LaLanne did. But at the end of the day or halfway through the day when you're tired and you flop in a chair, it's probably the wrong thing to do. What we really need to do is take a walk. It's not hard to walk 30 minutes a day. All you have to do is turn off Seinfeld. You've already seen that episode 8 times. You know what's going to happen. Close the door, go outside, walk 15 minutes, turn around and come home. That's a 30-minute walk. Everybody can get it in. The biggest excuse that people use for not walking is they don't have the time. As a caregiver, you have to make the time for yourself because that's when you meditate, that's when you think about things, that's when the opportunity comes to put things in perspective. The second big rule that I have is put healthy food in your refrigerator. We're all people. What do we eat? We eat whatever's in the fridge. We eat whatever's in the cupboard. If you only have chips in the cupboard and frozen pizza in the fridge, that's what you're going to eat. Make the rules real simple for yourself. Force it so you have to eat for health. This is the wrong time. When you're a caregiver, it's the wrong time to get sick. Do something like never have a meal without a fruit or vegetable. Now that's a rule everybody can remember. You know how many fruit and vegetables the average American eats? About 1.5 to 2. And the most common fruit or vegetable we eat is the potato. Cooked how? French fried. I'm not counting French fries as fruit and vegetables. I'm talking bananas and guava and papaya and broccoli. Never have a meal without a fruit or vegetable and you will be markedly on the way to good health. We talk about the Mediterranean diet and people don't know what it means. But it starts, if I'm doing a quick diet survey with a patient, I start by asking how many fruits and vegetables they ate. When a person tells me that they ate 7 or 8, I know I'm dealing with a healthy patient. I have a lot of patients who tell me none. But as a caregiver, it makes a huge difference what kind of fuel we put in our engine. My third rule for caregiving is to pay attention to your numbers. You should know your own health numbers, your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your blood sugar, etc., like you know your bank balance. For better or worse, you got to know what's in the checking account. For better or worse, you have to know what your blood pressure is. Because if it's not good, we have pills to treat it. We treat it for a reason. All the heart attacks and strokes that happen, and they're still the leading cause of death and disability in America, and 1/3 of the people who have a heart attack die when they have their first one, and 20% of the people who have a heart attack have it before the age of 65. What are the big causes of heart attacks and strokes? Smoking, blood pressure, high cholesterol, low HDL, diabetes. They're the standard risk factors we've always learned about. But we have to treat those so you don't get sick. And far too often, patients simply don't know what their numbers are. What's your blood pressure? I haven't got a clue. Gee, maybe we ought to know because we might be able to treat it. It makes a huge difference if you're going to stay healthy to think about treating the risk factors we know we need to treat. Caregiving is an important journey. You know that. That's why you're here. That's why you're listening to this. It's a journey that you take for others, but you owe it to that other person to take care of yourself. And taking care of yourself is a gift that you give both to them and to yourself. And I wish you well on the journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that medical walk for those of us who are called upon to take that journey as caregivers. How about a final round of applause for our 3 wonderful presenters? They spoke from the heart tonight. Sherri, Dr. Montgomery, and Dr. Gleeson. Thank you very much. Once again, the link to our Next Avenue website can be accessed at www.mptv.org. That's where you'll find helpful articles, also videos and resource information about lifestyle issues of special importance to those among our audience who are 50 and older on Milwaukee Public Television. Our next MPTV Community Conversation is scheduled for December 13th. The discussion will focus on living and learning, and you can join us again on the MPTV Next Avenue website or in person on the 13th at the John Michael Kohler Arts Center. That's in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. We invite members of our audience here on campus to stay with us as our presenters have graciously agreed to take questions for the next 30 minutes regarding caregiving, health, and well-being in general. We have one microphone set up, I think it's staged right there by John Larshine, who is directing our program tonight from the floor. We'll give you a moment or so to get in line and prepare your questions as we start that segment of our overall presentation tonight. In the meantime, we'd like to say thank you to members of our MPTV broadcast and internet audience for joining us. We're going to leave you now as we conclude tonight. And I think we have, John, we have about maybe 30 seconds or so before we leave our MPTV internet audience. Am I correct? I think it's about time to say goodbye as you're giving us the wrap-up sign. So thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to you joining us again on December 13th from Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Good night.